Hello, my name is Colin, and this episode of Let's Learn Blender is going to be all about bones, armatures, and rigging. In this video, we're going to be using Blender to add a skeleton, in other words, an armature, into our 3D scene that controls this little character. In Blender, unless your character is like a robot or a Lego person, where every single part of the character at every joint is modeled entirely separately, in which case you could simply create a parent-child link or hierarchy so you can animate the character and pose each part of it separately. It turns out that when you have a character model that is largely one mesh or maybe a few different pieces put together, it turns out that you need to use an armature in order to make a character posable and bendable at the elbows and knees and things like that. And so in this video, I'm going to be showing you exactly how to create an armature from scratch, from one single bone, into a fairly complex IK or inverse kinematics rig that is easy to pose and animate. By the way, in this video, I'm going to be using a model called the Cartoon Knight by Lucas de Miguel. Now, if you were to go ahead and get this model for yourself, you would notice that it comes pre-made with a rig. Now, this rig is awesome. This rig has custom bone shapes. It has fancy on-off IK, FK toggles right there in your 3D scene. We're not going to be going quite this far with our rig. Our rig is going to be a basic IK or inverse kinematics rig that'll be pretty respectable and you'll be able to animate with it. So if you want to go ahead and follow along with me for this video, you can go ahead and get this file that has just the character model itself in the file. You can go ahead and find a link to download it in the description area below this video here on YouTube, of course. So I'm going to start off here by just changing my 3D viewport from rendered viewport shading over to material preview mode, and that'll just give my scene some more even lighting and it'll make working in the viewport a little bit easier. And I'm going to point out to you that this character is modeled quite wisely in the very middle of my scene. You can see that the blue Z-axis line in my scene runs right through the middle of my character. And you can see if I look at my scene from the right side with the number pad 3 on my keyboard, the character is pretty well in the middle of the scene, left and right as well, or front and back in this case. And my character is fairly symmetrical. That means that they are posed in, this is called a relaxed T-pose. The character's arms are sticking not quite straight out, and the fingers aren't perfectly straight out either. It's kind of a relaxed, but still neutral position that's going to be easy for us to create an armature that is symmetrical without too much left and right differentiation. Now, to add an armature into Blender, you're going to want to go up to the Add menu and select Armature. But before you do that, if your character is lined up left to right evenly and they're in the middle of their world, well, it makes sense that you want to add your armature into the middle of your world as well. In fact, I'm going to suggest that you add your armature into the middle, the very middle of your world precisely. And that means you're going to want to put your 3D cursor where all new objects get created to the middle of your world precisely. So I'm going to go ahead and I actually don't need to use this 3D cursor tool at all. But what I'm going to do is press Shift S on my keyboard. Shift S will bring up the snapping menu, which will allow me to put my 3D cursor to the world origin precisely, which is 0, 0, 0 in my XYZ coordinates. So once my 3D cursor is there, I can go up to the Add menu and add an armature. When you add an armature, it is a single bone inside of an armature object. And of course, you can customize the armature to be multiple bones, but all within the armature's edit mode. So this armature has one bone. If I go up to my mode menu, you can see that unlike a mesh object, an armature has only 3 different modes. Object mode, which is what we're in right now. It also has edit mode where you can customize, add more bones, set the bones up, create parent-child links between different bones. And then finally pose mode, which is what you use when you're essentially done creating the armature and you want to pose or animate your character. That's where you do that work. Right now, I'm going to go into edit mode where I can select individual bones, in this case, my only existing bone. But you should know that bones, at least in this view, have a few parts. There is the main part of the bone. There is the head of the bone. That's the joint at the beginning of the bone where you might have another bone attached to this bone, as well as the tail of a bone. Now, right now, this bone, if I switch between my different views, you can tell that it's running through the middle of my character, and that's good. But what I can do is go down to the Object Data tab right here, which when you're in edit mode of an armature, looks like a little person. And just so we can see the entire bone, I'm going to go under Viewport Display, under the Object Data tab right there, and I'm going to turn on in front. Now, in old versions of Blender, this used to be called X-ray mode, and I think that was a good name for it as well. Essentially, this lets us see bones through a character mesh, even if the bones are inside or behind the mesh object. So now you can see, I can see the bones no matter what. I'm going to take this bone and select it by clicking on the middle of the bone, and I'm going to move it up inside of edit mode because this bone is going to be my little character's pelvis bone. So I'll just move it up so that the bottom of the bone, if I go to my side view, I can see it more clearly, is roughly at the location of where a pelvis bone would be. So I'll move it down a little bit like that. And I can make this bone smaller by grabbing the bone's tail, and using my move tool, of course, I can move the tail down to make the bone smaller. And if I zoom in, you can kind of see where it is. I might take the entire bone itself and move it back a little bit. And if you look at human anatomy, you will notice that pelvic bones tend to tilt forward. So I'm going to grab the tail of the bone and move it a little bit forward, a little bit more accurately. So if I go back to my front view, it still looks like it's up and down. It's still in the middle. That's great. To make more bones, to make a spine and a rib cage and a neck and a head bone, because every part of your character needs a bone, we can simply select the tail joint on a bone and tap E on our keyboard to extrude out a new bone from the tail of an existing bone. So for my side view, maybe I'm going to select that tail little orb, and I'll tap E on my keyboard and move my mouse up, and I get another bone that's attached to the original bone. So when I'm happy with where the new bone is, I can simply click to make that bone placed where it is. And of course, I can select either the head or tail of the bone and move and adjust. I'll tap G on my keyboard where exactly the bone starts and ends at any time in edit mode. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to select the tail of my little spine bone here, and I'm going to tap E and extrude up. I'm going to call this bone the rib cage because anatomically humans have a larger rib cage section of their spine, which really doesn't bend very much. So I'll make it a little bit bigger there, as you can see. And so my spine is going to be actually quite small on this character. That's fine. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to select the tail joint here, and I'm going to tap E to extrude out a neck, and I'll make the neck go to right about there. And finally, E, a head bone, and I'll put the head bone straight up and down. So after I tap E, I'll tap Z on my keyboard and then move it up to the top and click. It's as easy as that. Now, a few important things to point out to you here is that we are right now inside of edit mode of one armature object. This armature happens to have multiple bones, but if I go back into this object's object mode, you can see that this armature is basically one thing, one object in my 3D scene. In order to edit the individual bones, they are not their own armatures. They are just individual bones inside of one armature object, so I can go back into edit mode to edit them individually. The other thing to point out about these bones is that they are connected. They are children, one after the other, with an overall parent of the very first bone that I started with in this armature. So the pelvis bone, which right now is called just bone, has a child bone, and I can go ahead and select that child bone and look at what its parent is. In other words, its relationship with another bone in the armature, by going down to the bone tab. This is a secondary tab. It's also, I believe, an object data tab, but secondary because we have multiple things in the same object. Under the relations section heading here, in that bone tab, we can see that its parent is just the bone named bone. If I select the bone that's next, the ribcage bone, which is called bone.002, we'll rename these bones in a few minutes, you can see that this bone's parent is bone 001. So if I were to go into pose mode, which is where we can actually animate and pose our character, if I grab this pelvis bone and tap G and move it, you can see that it's moving all of its children. However, if I go ahead and grab a middle bone, the ribcage bone, and I tap G, well, it's not going to let me move it because it's attached to the bone that is its parent, the spine bone. However, when I tap G, it actually does the best that it can. It rotates, and its children, the neck and the head bone, they stick to it, they move along with it. Now, typically, you wouldn't pose your character at all, any of the bones, before you're finished rigging your character at all. So what I'm going to do here in pose mode is press A on my keyboard. A, of course, selects all in Blender, and when you're in pose mode, A selects all of the bones that you can see in your armature. And I'm going to go up to this pose menu and say Clear Transform All. What that'll do is if I've posed the character, it'll just reset it to its default pose, which usually is pretty much how you create the bones when you're in edit mode and creating the bones in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to press tab now to get into edit mode, or I can use my mode menu up here, of course. And I'm going to keep going. From my front view, I'm going to select the little joint that's at the base of the neck, and I'm going to extrude out. So I'll tap E, a shoulder bone, and that shoulder bone will go to the base of the arm. And I'll click. So there we go. And from the top view, I can see, is it roughly in the right spot? From the side view, probably not. I'm going to actually move the tail of that shoulder out to the middle of the arm. And maybe I'll take the rib cage and the neck and move them back as well. And maybe I'll move back this bone as well and move it down as well. And you can see we can adjust things as we go. Now, this shoulder bone needs to end where the arm is going to rotate, where his shoulder socket bone would be in real life. So maybe I'll move it to right about there. And I'm going to select that tail and tap E, and I'm going to extrude out the entire arm all the way until the wrist, because I want to show you that you can select an entire bone itself and you can right click on it and say subdivide. And when you subdivide a bone, it cuts it into two bones. In fact, if you were to subdivide a bone, you could go down to the subdivide little pop over down here right after you did right click subdivide, and you could make one bone into many bones if you like. I'm going to leave it at just one subdivision, so 2 bones. There you go. And from the top view, I'm going to make sure it looks good. In fact, I'm going to go into wireframe view and just take a look at where my elbow is. So I'm going to take the little joint orb right there and tap G and put it right about there. I'm going to intentionally put a little bit of a bend in the arm, and that'll help us pose it more accurately later on. From my front view, I'm going to extrude a simple set of hand and finger bones. Because my character is essentially wearing mittens, I can get away with not having individual finger bones. So I might move the tail of that bone there. I'll tap E, extrude out a hand bone to right about there. And then I'll tap E again and just create one finger bone like that. How does it look from the top view? Well, it's a little bit too far to the back, so I might move these 2 bones forward, something like that. Now, if I want to have a set of bones to be able to control the thumb separately, well, I could just select this joint here, of course, and I could tap E on my keyboard. I'm going to make a simplified version of this. So maybe a bone from there to there, roughly. From the front view, I'll need to move that down. And then from the top view, I'll maybe extrude out a bone to there, and I'll have to move that down. And I'm going to go pretty quickly for the sake of this video to right about there, and maybe there. And then I'm going to take that single thumb bone, and because I do want some articulation, I will right click and say subdivide, and then I'll take the joint in the middle of those 2 new bones, and I will move it a little bit to make it have a little bit of bend from the get-go. So here we have a set of bones for our arm, our hand, our fingers. What I'm going to point out to you, though, is that if I go into pose mode just temporarily and I try to pose my hand, this hand bone has only one direct child, the fingers. And you might think the thumb would be, and all of its pieces would be children of the hand as well. And they should be, but because I extruded out the thumb from the end or the tail of the lower arm bone, the thumb therefore is a child of the lower arm and not the hand. So if I were to pose the hand, the thumb doesn't move along with it when it should. So I'm going to right click to put it back in the right spot. And of course I could press A to select all and pose clear transform all. to reset all the bones to their default pose. So I'm going to go back into edit mode. I'll use the menu this time, and I'm going to select the top thumb bone, and then I'll hold shift and select the hand bone and press Control P to make the thumb a child of the hand instead of the lower arm. And in this case, I'm going to say keep offset, because when you make a bone a child of another bone, well, if a bone is a direct connected child of another bone, that means that it would start at the parent bone's tail down here. We don't want the thumb to start down there. We want to start wherever it should be, right up here. So we're going to say not connected. What was that option called? I'll do it again. Select the thumb and the hand, Control P. Keep offset was the option that I chose, not connected. Okay, let's go ahead and create some legs and feet bones. So down on my character's lower half, I'm going to add a new bone to start the upper part of the leg. So right now, if I actually go up to the add menu and add a new single bone, I don't need to extrude out from the pelvis bone to make a leg, because we don't need a shoulder for the pelvis. I can just create a new bone starting from right here. So because my 3D cursor still in edit mode is down here, if I go up to the add menu, because I'm in edit mode of an armature right now, I don't have all the other options to add things like mesh objects and cameras and lights. The only thing I can add is single bone. So that's the only option it gives me. So add single bone. It adds one right where that 3D cursor is. I'm going to go ahead and grab it, and I'll move it up to where the start or top of that leg should start, somewhere right around there. From the side view, I'm going to go ahead and move it back to right there. And I can grab the tail of the bone. I'll tap G and move it all the way down to where basically the ankle would be. And I can go ahead and zoom in. To make this leg have two pieces, of course, I can select it, and then I'll right click and say subdivide. That'll chop the one bone into two, but it of course makes a child and parent link when it makes those two separate bones. I'm going to give the leg a little bit of a bend right there, so it's not perfectly straight. And I'm going to put the ankle where the person's ankle would essentially be. So I'm not going to put it all the way down at the bottom, more like up here. That'll bend more naturally. When we go to pose and animate the character, I'll tap E on my keyboard to extrude a new foot bone to right about there. And then I'll tap E and then Y to extrude, and then constrain to front and back, or forward and backward, the toe bone. So there we go. How does it look from the front view? It looks okay. I might want to grab the lower leg and feet and toe bones and just move them a little bit over to keep things centered like that. You will notice that I'm only modeling or creating an armature for half of my character, and that is intentional because we can have Blender do the opposite half automatically for us, assuming that we name all of our bones correctly in a way that Blender recognizes the difference between the left shoulder and the right shoulder. Before we start naming these bones, I will point out that inside of this armature, my leg is not at all attached to the pelvis, and we need it to be. So I'm going to select my leg bone, hold shift, select my pelvis bone. We need to make the upper leg a child, but not connected, but still a child of the pelvis bone. So when we move the pelvis, it moves the upper leg as well. So with these two bones selected in that order, Control P, keep offset is what we want to do. And now this bone has a parent. Under relations, under the bone tab, the parent is the bone, which is the pelvis. Speaking of which, we need to name our bones. And so what I can do is select each bone in edit mode and press F2 on our keyboard. Now on my keyboard, I have an extra function toggle button. Otherwise, my function keys act like media control buttons. So I had to turn on the little FN key, and then F2 acts like a normal F2 key on a computer keyboard. Once I've done that, F2 lets me rename a bone with a little popover up here. I'm going to name this bone pelvis and press enter. If you can't use your function keys and you want to name bones just in Blender's interface, you can go over to the bone tab, and then up to the top, you can name the bone right there. Okay, it's not the object That one is called Armature. It's the whole Armatures name, but under the bone tab, you can name each bone. I'm going to go ahead and very quickly name the center row of bones with these names over on the right side of your screen right now. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this part of the video up. I'm going to go ahead and press F2 on my keyboard, and here we go. So we have all the bones named in the middle of the character. They are named head, neck, ribs, spine, and pelvis. When we're naming bones that are on the left or the right side of the character, in this case, these bones that we've created for our arm and the leg are on the character's left side, we're going to name them with a special format that I suggest that you use because Blender will recognize it and will help you out in very nice ways. And that is when you name one of these bones, I'll select the shoulder and I'll press F2 on my keyboard. I'm going to name this shoulder. But here's the thing that you should do is you should add a dot and then the capital L for left. So shoulder dot L, I'll press enter. That L is capital, of course. I'm going to name this bone. You might think I might name it upper arm dot L, but I tend to like to put the name of the limb first. So I'm going to switch these around a little bit. I'm going to name this arm upper .l, and that way when I'm searching for things or looking for things, I'm not finding things called upper arm and upper leg next to one another. In other words, all the arm pieces will be listed together. I tend to prefer that, so I'll name it like that. So arm upper.l. I'm going to go ahead and speed this part of the video up. I'm going to name all of these bone pieces with the names up on the screen right now. So let's go ahead and do this very quickly. Okay, so let's go ahead and name the legs and feet and toes with the following names that are on the screen right now. I'll speed this part of the video up. And there we go. We've got all of our bones named, at least for the bones on the character's left-hand side. Now, if we were ready to, we could have Blender automatically take all of the bones on the character's left side and duplicate them and flip them. So we would have a complete left and right character rig, complete with all the naming automatically done for us, because Blender can recognize when you put .L on a bone, and when it creates a flipped copy of those bones, it will automatically name all of those .L copies to .R, which is super, super nice and handy. But there's one problem with this rig, and that is if I go into this Armature Objects pose mode and I try to pose just the armature as it is, yeah, we haven't added the controls so that our armature is actually controlling the mesh of the character right now, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this video. But right now, if I try to pose this character, let's say I want to have their hand be up here next to their head. I'll actually turn on material preview mode right there. If I try to grab this hand and I tap G on my keyboard and try to move it up to right there next to the character's head, like they're going to wave, well, I can't do that. And that's because what we have right now is called a forward kinematic, in other words, an FK rig. Now, what that means is that because each bone is a child or a parent of the bone before or the bone after that bone, well, it means that if we grab the hand, we can't move the hand's parent, the lower arm, or its grandparent, the upper arm, just by moving the hand. When you move a child in a parent-child hierarchy that goes up a chain like we have right now, well, a child can't move its parents. So in other words, if we want to move the arm and the hand so that the character is going to wave with their hand up next to their head, I would need to select their uppermost parent bone in that chain first. I might tap R to rotate that bone, to pose that bone where it's going to be. And then down the chain, the next child down, I would need to rotate that one. And then maybe I'll take this bone and rotate it. Maybe I'll double tap R to make it face forward. And then we've got that arm and the hand in the right pose. But this process of having to actually pose and rotate each individual bone is a little bit of an arduous process and would take far too long to animate anything in a realistic pipeline and timeline. So there is a better way, and it is called IK, or inverse kinematics. What we're going to be setting up right now will allow us to grab just the hand and move the hand up, and we can control how many bones up the succession of parents and grandparents, the hand will be able to control, which will allow us to pose our character much, much easier. The same process we'll do to the feet and legs. So if we want to make the character step up, we don't have to rotate each bone in the leg to pose the entire leg. We can just grab the foot. Okay, let's go ahead and back to my front view. I'm going to go ahead and press A on my keyboard to select all of my bones. I want to clear this pose out so it goes back to the default pose. So A to select all the bones, pose, clear transform, all. By the way, this all under clear transform in pose, it doesn't have a keyboard shortcut. And so what you can do instead is right click on this all option in the menu and say add to quick favorites. What that'll allow you to do is simply, once you've done that, you can go and press the letter Q on your keyboard, and anything that you've already added to quick favorites will be listed here. Now, the fact that this says all isn't very helpful, but as long as you remember that that's what that's for, you can use it. And so I'll click on all after pressing Q on my keyboard to bring that menu up, and it clears all of the location, rotation, scale of all the bones that I have selected, which is really nice. So I have half of my armature, and it is a forward kinematics rig. To make an IK rig, I need to make a couple of targets in my rig, in my arm, one for the hand. It's going to be a separate bone that's going to act like a target to control all of the upper bones. In other words, the arm lower and arm upper bones along that chain, as well as a target for the elbow. And then we'll do targets, IK targets for the foot and the knee. If you don't know what I mean by targets, don't worry, you'll understand in just a moment. In fact, up here at the hand of my character, a target, an IK target, is going to be a duplicate bone that is not part of the same child-parent hierarchy, but still a bone that's in your armature. So we're not going to create a separate armature at all for this. We're going to create a duplicate hand right now. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, select my hand bone, and then I'll press Shift D on my keyboard. Shift D will of course duplicate to create a copy of that selected bone. And I'm going to right click right away to put that copy bone right in the exact same spot as its original. Now this target, we do not want it to be a part of the same chain of parent children. So with that duplicate bone selected, I'm going to go over to the bone tab down here, and I'm going to turn off or remove its parent, because right now we made a duplicate of the original hand bone, and because the original hand bone had a parent, so does the duplicate. So I'm going to go ahead and remove, I'll click this little X right here, the parent of this new hand IK target. And still with that bone selected, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to rename it over here, hand IK dot L, and I'll press enter. Yes, I could have used F2 there, but we were already there in that tab, so I just used that little input box right there. And to make this bone differentiated visually from the original hand bone, I'm going to press N on my keyboard, or that little tiny arrow right there, to bring up my properties panel at the side of my 3D viewport. And under the item tab at the top, you can see this bone's properties. Again, we are still in edit mode of the armature. So I can change this bone's length right in place. And if I turn on X-ray view in my viewport right here, you can see now I can see bones that are inside of bones, which is what this one is. And I'm going to make this IK hand .L bone a little bit longer than my hand, just to make it different and easy to see, and more importantly, easy to select one from the other. Okay, I might want to actually hold Shift on my keyboard and then click and drag with Shift held down to make it more accurate and a more precise, just slightly larger like that. Now, the reason why we need this secondary bone is because when you're setting up an IK system for the arm of your character, the IK target needs to be a separate bone that's not constrained to its parent, because it doesn't even have one in the first place. And we're going to be adding a bone constraint to the forearm or lower arm bone that will be told to point always and stick to the IK target bone. That's how it works. So we have this hand IK bone. It has no parent. It's a little bit bigger than the actual hand bone. Now I need to go into pose mode of my armature. So I'll go up to the mode menu and go into pose mode. And I'm going to tell the lower arm or forearm bone to always stick to that hand IK bone With a chain length, that means up the arm all the way up to the elbow. And that means two bones are going to be affected and always kind of stick to wherever we move the hand IK target bone. To do this, I'm going to select that forearm bone and go over to the second to bottom tab in my properties editor when you have a bone selected in pose mode. And that is the bone constraints tab down here. Oh, make sure that your forearm bone is selected, not any other bone. You want to add a constraint to the lower arm bone. So with it selected, I'm going to go and add a bone constraint called inverse kinematics. That is IK for short. When you add this constraint to the forearm bone, it's going to give you a little dotted line from the tail of that bone, the wrist essentially, all the way down to the root of your entire chain. And what it's going to be looking for is what bone should be this whole chain's target. And that's going to be our hand IK bone. So with this forearm bone selected under the options of that constraint, we need to choose the target right here. And so I'm going to click in that box and just choose the armature for now. And then once we've selected the armature, I'm going to choose the specific bone to be the target. So I'm going to click in bone. I'll type hand IK, and then you can see it's right there. I can search for hand and then click on the right one. So there we go. If I were to now select that hand IK bone and tap G, you would see that I can move that target bone and it's making all of the bones up this chain kind of follow it. Now, too much is happening here. When I move the hand IK target, I don't want the entire skeleton to move. I only want there to be a chain length of two bones that are affected by the movement of this target bone. So I'm going to select all the bones. I'll press A on my keyboard in pose mode. I'll press Q on my keyboard to clear all, or of course, pose, clear, transform, all. My bones go back to their default orientation and pose. What I can do now is select that forearm bone and change the chain length here from 0, which goes all the way, it's infinite, essentially all the way up to the very root of the entire chain of bones, up to 1 and 2. And you should be able to see at this point, when you do that, a little dotted yellow line that goes all the way up to the top of the arm, just below the shoulder. Okay, so now if I grab that hand IK target bone, G, you can see that I can pose my arm and the elbow is right there, and the elbow is bending as needed, and it's quite easy to pose. Not so easy though, because this hand, the actual original hand bone that will be controlling the mesh hand of my character, is still pointing whichever way is default based on the rotation of its parent. What we're going to do is make the hand, the actual hand, follow or copy the rotation of our IK hand. So we'll only need to animate the IK hand to pose the entire arm and to rotate the actual hand. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll press A on my keyboard to select all the bones. I'll press Q for my quick favorites and all. I'm going to select my original hand, the smaller one, the one that actually controls the mesh of my character, or the one that will. And I'm going to add, under the Bone Constraints tab, a bone constraint called Copy Rotation. When I do that, it turns, I believe, green, and we need to tell it what to copy the rotation of. In this case, I need to give this copy rotation, which is on hand.l, not handIK.l, a target. So I'm going to select the armature, and then I'm going to give it the hand IK.l target. And so now it should always copy in real time the rotation of our target hand IK bone. So now if I grab that hand IK target, the bigger one, and I tap G, you can see that it works a lot better. And if I pose the hand up there, I can then tap R and rotate just the hand IK bone, and it'll move the actual hand bone as well, which is quite nice. You will notice that you will be able to grab the hand IK bone and move it past where the actual hand bone can go. That is just a limitation of this system. We could put constraints on this hand IK bone that stops us from moving it way out of our scene. Just be careful though, as an animator, you should get used to this pretty quickly and get used to how to move it and not get it too far beyond where the actual arm can go. You generally don't want your arms to hyper extend unless you really intend to have them do that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press A to select all the bones, Q to clear all the rotation, location, and scale of my entire rig, By the way, when you have these IK target bones, generally, and this is quite important for a few steps a little bit later on, we want to select all of our IK targets as we make them and go to the bone tab for that IK target bone and turn off deform. What this option does, deform, is if you have it turned on and we go a little bit later in this video and we want to attach all of the mesh pieces of the character to all of the bones and have the character actually posable, we don't want the IK bones to actually pull any vertices in the mesh. We just want these IK bones to act like controllers for other bones and not the mesh of the character. So we turn on the IK targets, we turn deform to off. Okay, but you will notice that with our hand, when we move our hand up or anywhere, it's very now difficult to control where the elbow is pointing in our character. If I want to make my character, let's say, do something like, well, what I'm doing right now, basically, my character could do the chicken dance if I rotated this bone. We're actually rotating one of the arm bones. Instead of actually having to manipulate an arm bone, one or the other, what we want to do instead is add a pull target to the other end of our IK constrained bone. What this means is I'm going to go ahead and press A and then Q and clear all the transformation in my pose. I'm going to go back into edit mode and I'm going to add basically a target bone where my elbow should be pointed at. And therefore, if I have a target bone for my elbow, me later as the animator will need to animate that elbow target in order to make my character's elbow point up or down or wherever it needs to point. So with my elbow joint selected right there in edit mode, I'm going to tap E on my keyboard to make a new bone coming right from the elbow. And I'm going to tap Y on my keyboard and make this new bone extrude backward. So from the side view right there, I've gone straight back on the Y axis, E and then Y. I'll make the bone about that size. Now, IK target bones do not have parents, so I'm going to select that bone. I'm going to go down to under the bone tab, and under relations, I'm going to turn off parent or remove its parent. And therefore, when I select that bone, I can move it straight back. And then with it out there, I'm going to make this bone, the head of that bone, that joint at the beginning where the elbow is, always point in that direction. So to do that with that bone selected, the forearm bone, I'm going to go back into pose mode, and I can see now if I select that bone, the constraint options for my IK constraint. And here I'm going to select the pull target as that elbow IK bone. So I'm going to select the armature as the pull target, and then it'll give me the bone option. And here I'm going to actually have to name that bone. So I'm going to select that bone, and under the bone tab, I'm going to call it elbow IK.L. And yes, I can name bones in pose mode. That's okay to do. So under the constraints of my forearm bone, I'm going to point it to elbow IK.L. And that's going to be the pull target. When I do that, you might get lucky and it might just work right away. If I grab my hand bone and I move it, in towards the body, is that elbow pointed towards the elbow IK target? No, it's not. And I'm actually glad about that because it might need a little bit of different tweaking depending on your specific model. So I'll go ahead and adjust this as needed for mine. What I need to do here is select that bone that I have my constraint on, the forearm bone, and change the pull angle because we want that bone, its head, to point at the IK elbow target. So this pull angle, I'm going to try moving it. It's not going to be a positive direction, so I'm going to try a negative direction. And from my side view, I can just kind of eyeball it. I'm kind of drawing a line out there, and that looks pretty good to me. This is a fairly odd number. Often it'll be a negative 90 or a positive 90 or a negative or positive 120 degrees. In this case, is negative 120. Going to be a good number. Yeah, that's pretty good. So now if I grab this bone in pose mode and I move it up and down, you can see my little character can do the chicken dance. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and set up IK for our leg. And this time I'm going to show you a shortcut to make this process easier. I'll go ahead and press A and Q and clear all transforms for all my bones in pose mode. I'm going to go ahead and select the foot because I need to make an IK target for the foot. I'll press Tab to go into edit mode of my armature. I'm going to duplicate the foot. Shift D on my keyboard. I'm going to right click to put it back in the exact same spot. I'm going to press F2 right away. I'm going to name it foot ik.l and press enter. Foot ik.l is going to be the IK target. If I go under the bone tab, I don't want this bone, the IK target, to have a parent. So under relations, under the bone tab, I'll get rid of its parent. I'm going to make this bone, the IK target, a little bit longer than the original foot bone, just so we can see a difference between them. So I'm going to change the length here. I'll hold Shift and drag to the right. Shift will make this change more accurate and slow and easy for me to control. So right about there. And I'm going to make a target for the knee, just like I have a target for the elbow up at the top there. So I'm going to select the knee joint, and from my side view, I'm going to extrude out a new bone, E, and then Y, and then I'll move that out and make a small little bone there. It needs to be called, I'll press F2 on my keyboard, knee, IK, dot capital L, just like that. And then under the bone tab, I'm going to get rid of its parent under the relations section right there. And I can move now this target bone out to where the knee, past where the knee would ever bend. Okay, so if a knee can touch this, you haven't gone and moved it out far enough. Okay, what you should also do, and this is a good habit, when you're making these IK bones, you should also always turn off deform. So with the knee selected, deform is now off. I'll select the foot bone, the foot IK bone rather, and I'll make sure deform is turned off for that as well. Don't forget that. Did we do that for the elbow? No, we didn't. So I'll turn that off right now. With the lower leg selected, I need to make it point at the foot IK target. To do that, I need to set up my constraint, which needs to be done in pose mode. So I'll go back from edit mode into pose mode. Now here's the shortcut for you. If you don't want to have to specify the target manually when you go and select your lower leg bone and go to the bone constraints tab in pose mode and add the constraint manually, you don't have to add it manually in this menu at all. The shortcut here is if you select your IK target first, and then you hold Shift, and this is in pose mode, and you hold Shift, and you select the bone that you actually want to add the constraint to last. So the target first, hold Shift, select the bone that you actually want to add the constraint to second, and you press Shift I. Shift I on your keyboard is a keyboard shortcut that's meant for adding IK exactly as we are doing right now. So Shift I, add IK to active bone. I'll click right there. And you can see when I do that, it adds the IK constraint to the last bone that I selected. So I selected this one, and then this one second, this one last. Therefore, this bone has the constraint, and it automatically now has the first bone that I selected as the target, which makes half of our work essentially done. I need to change my chain length to 1, 2 to make it go up to just the base of the leg. I need to choose my pole target, which is going to be knee ik.l. So right here, pole target, armature, knee ik.l. You can see that the pole target angle is not right. It looks like it actually might be 180 degrees wrong. So I'm going to try 180 like that. And now you can see that when I bend the leg up or move the foot up, it actually was not right. When we move the knee back and forth, it looks like it's almost doing the right thing, but I need to adjust. I'll press Q all to move that back into position. This bone, I need to adjust the pole angle so that it's pointing. And if I go to my top view, maybe I can see, or my bottom view, I can see where it's pointing to better. Just like that. I'm trying to draw a line straight out to there. How does that work? Let's go ahead and press A and then Q and clear all transformations. If I grab my foot IK target bone and I move it straight up, does the knee point at the right spot. If I move this back and forth, how does it look? If I move the foot IK target back and forth, it looks pretty good. If I press A and then Q and clear all transformations, you'll notice that the foot now is not in the right spot compared to the foot IK bone. And that's okay, because we need to make the foot match the rotation of the foot IK bone, just like we did for the hand. We made the hand copy the rotation of the hand IK target bone. So I'm going to select the foot bone. I'm going to add a bone constraint under that bone constraints tab. It's going to be copy rotation. I'm going to select a target, and then the bone is going to be called foot ik.l. And there we have it. Now I can just grab the foot IK bone and I can grab it and pose my character. One thing that might help you out before you start adding IK constraints, if you want to have fewer issues with the angles of your pole targets, you can go into edit mode of your armature. And with all of your IK bones already there, so I already have my elbow and knee targets, I already have my hand IK and foot IK target bones. Before you start adding constraints though, what you should probably do is select all of your bones inside of edit mode and fix the roles of all of the individual bones all at once. Now, bones, as you can see, can get twisted. If I press Control R on my keyboard, I can change the role, how twisted a bone is. In other words, its local kind of rotation. Now, when you start adding these constraints, you want to make sure that all of your bones are consistent in your armature. And when you are just extruding out bones, they are probably not. So the solution to this is if you go to your front view in Blender and you press A to select all of your bones in edit mode, what you can do is you can reset all of your bones roll at once from the perspective of your current view, which for me is front orthographic. I pressed 1 on my numpad to get there, or I could press the -Y, I believe, as well, right up in there in that gizmo. So with all my bones selected now in edit mode, I can go up to Armature, Bone Roll, Recalculate Roll, and then I can say View Axis, and that will reset all of the bones to be consistent based on the view that I'm looking at them from right now. And the front's a pretty good view to have. So View Axis like that. If I go back into pose mode now, you can see my arm is looking pretty good. If I grab this elbow IK target bone and move it up and down, is my elbow pointing at it in a nice way. From my side view, if I move my elbow up and down, not quite. So it will change the way that your elbows point, but it'll be a little bit nicer, hopefully, in terms of its values. So I'm going to change this pull angle back to 0, just so you can see what the default is. And if I move this bone, my elbow IK target, up and down, you can see that I think these bones are rotating 90 degrees off. Yeah. So if I select this bone, let's try -90. And you can see, hopefully, therefore, that this joint, the bend of the arm, is back to a nice, pointing a little bit backwards and not down or up or to the front or something like that. And so now if I grab the elbow target, that looks much better. Okay, it looks like its back is always pointing up or down, depending on where I put that elbow IK target bone. Okay, the foot and knee, however, are not great. I'm going to change the pull target angle of this bone back to 0. And you can see that with this constraint and the pull target chosen, that the leg is pointing in some very strange direction. So I'm going to change the pull angle to try to match. And if I press A on my keyboard and then Q and all, I can put my bones back in their default pose. And now if I select my lower leg where my constraint is, if I change my pull angle back to 0, how are we doing here? Well, from the side view, it looks like my leg is pointing backwards based on the angle of these bones and that dotted yellow line there. So if I go to my front view, yeah, it's not doing so well. So I'm going to try rotating this, in fact, 180 degrees. And from the side, it's now pointing more to the front. And so now if I move this bone left and right, Is that right? Let's go ahead and try moving the foot IK bone up, G, and then Z on my keyboard. No, it's not right at all. It should point towards the knee target. So I'm going to grab this bone and then change the pull angle so it matches. And if I go to my front view, I'll be able to see that 120 is a common value, although in this case, I think I'm going to use something like 128 or so. Okay, so there is my setup. How does it work if I grab the foot IK target bone and move it up? You can see that I can now make my character's knees go out or in like that. There is one more bone to make in this setup before we copy all of the bones on our left character side over to the right. And so I'm going to press A on my keyboard and then Q and clear all the transformations in pose mode, AQ, and then select all. And that last bone that we're going to create in edit mode, I'll go back to edit mode, is going to be a controller bone. Because you might want to just move your whole character around in your scene without having to grab your character's pelvis. Maybe you want to grab all of the IK targets and all of the character all at once and just slide them around the set to put your character in the right spot. It will be very beneficial to you to have a bone that's right on the floor, right at the base of your character. So in edit mode, I'm just going to press Shift S on my keyboard to make sure my 3D cursor is back at the origin of where the armature is at 0, 0, 0 in my world. So Shift S and then cursor to world origin. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard in edit mode. Shift A will add a new bone right away, starting right at 0, 0, 0. And I'm just going to go ahead and move the tip of that bone down, straight down on the Z axis, pointing down a little bit, just like that or so. It doesn't matter how long this bone is. That's a good spot. And this bone is going to be the parent of not only the entire actual character bones, so it's going to be a parent of the pelvis, which was the original parent of everything else. So I'm going to select the pelvis, hold Shift in edit mode, and I'm going to select this controller bone, and I'm going to press Control P, make parent, but keep offset. So we'll click on keep offset. I'm also going to now make all of these IK target bones, the elbow, the knee, the foot IK, and the hand IK. Right now, they don't have any parents. And so if I were to go into pose mode and move this controller bone around, I'll grab my move tool and that bone in pose mode, and I'll move it forward. You'll notice that the IK bones are left behind, and I don't want that. So I'm going to press Q and clear out that transformation, put that bone back where it should be at the origin of my scene. And back in edit mode, I'm going to select all 4 of my IK target bones. The elbow, the knee, I'll zoom in here, the foot, the whole foot, and the hand, the IK hand, pardon me. And then I will select that controller bone last with Shift, of course, and Control P, and then keep offset. Like that. So now all of those 4 IK bones are children directly of the controller. And that means in pose mode, I can grab just that controller and move the entire character rig as it is. And that will move the entire character. Okay. Back into edit mode, we need to make a second half of our character. And so I'm going to select all of the bones. I'll press A in edit mode. Blender has an automatic flip and duplicate and rename built in, and that is simply when you have all the bones selected in your entire rig, you can right click and you can say Symmetrize. It's just that easy. If I click on Symmetrize, it will make a duplicate of all the bones that end in .L. It'll flip them on the X-axis and it'll rename them all with .R. So it's really that easy. I have my entire rig now. If I go into pose mode, I can grab either hand IK target and pose, and I'll double tap R to rotate that hand up. I can put this hand down. I'll tap R on my keyboard to rotate that hand down. I'll rotate my view and make my character look like they are stepping up onto something. So I'll grab the foot IK target, move it up there, and maybe move the knee a little bit over like that. So I have my character rig posed. Now, because my character happens to be a little cartoon knight character with the shoulder pads and with a little visor object that we want to rotate, probably opening and closing throughout our animation, I'm actually going to make animating this character a little bit easier with those objects by adding bones for them as well. Bones in an armature don't just need to be for a character's limbs, they can be for other things as well. We might even add a bone for the sword. So I'm going to go ahead and select a bone in my armature. In pose mode, I can press A, of course, and Q to clear it out to its default pose. I'll press Tab to go back into edit mode of the armature. And I'm going to add a bone for each of the shoulder pads. So I'm going to press Shift A on my keyboard to add a new bone. I will grab it and put it up to the base of a shoulder pad or the top. And then I'll grab the tail and I'll move it down to right about there. From the top view, how does that look? I need to move it back a little bit. In fact, I'm going to move it over to the character's left side because I'm going to use that Symmetrize tool again, but on more bones that we add. These two bones for the shoulder pads. So right like that, I'm going to select that bone. I need to give it a name. So I'll press F2 on my keyboard. I'm going to call it shoulder pad .L, capital L there at the end. And with that bone selected, if I right click on it, I can say Symmetrize and hopefully it'll make a copy and name it shoulderpad.R. Isn't that nice? These bones do not have parents yet, and I'm going to parent each one to its respective upper arm bone. That's probably the one that's going to move most closely with. So I'll select this bone in edit mode, hold Shift, select the upper arm bone, Control P, make parent, keep offset. I'll click on keep offset. Same thing here, click, hold Shift, select, Control P, keep offset. Just like that. Now, because my character has this visor, I'm going to add a bone for that. To select part of my mesh, because I'm going to make the base of a bone for this visor stick straight out exactly starting in between the joints. So it rotates at the right point from the actual mesh of my character. What I want to do though is actually select part of the mesh and figure out where the bone should start and put my 3D cursor there. Right now, because I'm in edit mode of a armature, I can't select the mesh because it's not in edit mode of the armature. So what I'm going to do is go back to object mode and I'm going to select my character's head. And that head object, if I press tab to go into edit mode, has these pieces at the side. And if I go into edge select mode and I hold Alt on my keyboard, I can select the edge loop, which it is right now. If I click on something else, you can see that all of those became deselected. So if I hold Alt and click on an edge, it selects an edge loop. I'm going to orbit around to the other side of my character and hold Shift to select more. I'll hold Shift and Alt though, because I'm going to select this other edge loop on the other side. So I will hold Shift and Alt and click just like that. So I have these two edge loops selected and I'm going to put my 3D cursor in the middle of those two loops. So I'll press Shift S on my keyboard and I'm going to say cursor to selected. I'm doing this so my 3D cursor goes to right in the exact right spot so that if I go back, I'll press tab into edit mode of my armature. I'll select my armature and press tab to go into edit mode. If I add a bone right now, Shift A on my keyboard will add a bone very quickly. It will rotate at the exact right spot for that visor when that visor needs to rotate. Okay. With the tail of this new bone selected, I'm going to press Shift S, and this time I'm going to say selection to cursor. I'm going to put this little tail right at that 3D cursor as well. So selection to cursor after Shift S. And now the bone is in a really scary point. Our bone basically has a length of 0. We don't want that. With the tail of the bone that is still selected, I'm going to move that tail forward. Exactly. Okay, don't leave your bone with the tail and the head at the exact same spot. That's bad news. Okay, so now we have the visor bone. Wonderful. Just before we get to attaching the entire character mesh to the skeleton, I need to make sure this visor bone has a parent. It should be attached to the head. So I'll select it, hold Shift, select the head bone, Control P, keep offset with make parent. Okay, and because the helmet in my case of my knight is one big piece, I actually don't need the head bone or the visor bone to be deformative, to deform any part of my mesh. And so this is going to save us a few steps a little bit later on. It might make our armature rig a little bit cleaner in the way it controls the mesh. I'm going to go back into pose mode, and I'm going to make these two bones, I'll select them one at a time, and go under the bone tab and turn off deform. What this means is that with deform turned off, when we go to make the entire body of the character attached to the bones, these bones won't influence the wrong parts. So turn off deform on bones that you know aren't part of where the character will do any bending at all, okay? This piece is not going to bend at all, so I should turn that bone's deform off. Same thing with the head bone. The head won't deform or bend at all, so I will turn deform off. Okay, now to actually attach the character's mesh, what we can actually see in our animation to the individual bones, we're going to use a special form of parenting. For the main part of my character, which will need to bend depending on which bones are bent in which way. When I bend the elbow, I want the mesh of my character's arm to bend appropriately. We're going to select that main part of the character and hold shift because we want to make it a child of the armature, but to each individual bone as appropriate to the armature. Essentially, if I press tab on my keyboard, what we're going to be doing here is making it so that each vertex of my character is going to be assigned a weight. That means an appropriate amount of control by its nearby bone. Now, for some vertices in my mesh, like the vertex in the middle of my character's chest, it's likely that that vertex will be entirely weighted or controlled by the ribcage bone. And that's fine. But some vertices in my mesh, like around the loop that's right at the elbow joint, well, those vertices will be controlled a little bit by the upper arm and a little bit by the lower arm. And so Blender has to figure that out for us. It doesn't always do a perfect job, but we can give it a shot. To do this, I'm going to press tab on my keyboard to go back into object mode. And I need to select that mesh, the main part of my character, hold shift, and then select my armature. So I'll hold shift, select the armature. I happen to be in pose mode right now, and that's fine. If you're not able to, in pose mode, by the way, select your mesh and back and forth, because usually you have to be in object mode to select different objects, you will need to go up to the edit menu and turn off lock object modes. With this option turned on, if you are in pose mode, you cannot select a mesh object. Okay, you are stuck to selecting only bones in that armature. So I can turn that off by going down to edit and lock object modes and turn it off. You also might find that if you have the X-ray mode turned on in your viewport, like I do right now, you may not also be able to select any mesh when you're in pose mode. I figured that out not too long ago. So X-ray needs to be off, and this option needs to be off lock object modes, and then you should be able to select mesh objects when you're in pose mode, okay? So the mesh object gets selected first. You hold shift, select any bone when in pose mode, doesn't matter which bone. You're gonna press Control P because you wanna make the last object you selected the parent of the first object that you selected, Control P. However, you're not gonna select object in this case. You're gonna select armature deform, but with automatic weights. Okay, that's gonna automatically assign each vertex to the right bone, hopefully. I'll click with automatic weights. When I do that, or when I just did that, it assigned every vertex to a bone to a certain amount. If I grab a bone in pose mode now, just that bone, actually I'll grab the hand IK target down there, and I grab the hand, you can see that I can now, especially if I turn off my overlays right there, so I'm hiding all of my bones, you will see that I can pose my character. And over here, if I turn on overlays again and grab the hand IK bone and turn off overlays, you can see that I can grab that bone. Now, normally you would leave overlays turned on while you're animating. Let's go and see what my foot looks like. I'll grab the foot IK bone and move it up. And you can see it's deforming the mesh. And I can move and pose and animate my character while in pose mode. I'll press Control Z to undo that move. As for the shoulder pads of my knight character, they are a separate mesh object, and therefore I'll have to parent them separately or in their own step to the appropriate bones. So I'm going to select my bones again. I'll select one of them in pose mode. I'll press A and then Q to clear out the transformations that I've done. Now, I will point out that these shoulder pads created by the original artist have a mirror modifier on them. That means that the shoulder pads actually are just one and not both of them. If I turn off this mirror modifier, you can see the only one that actually exists is the character's left one, but with the mirror modifier, it made a duplicate and flipped it over to the other side. That's wonderful. It turns out that's actually quite nice. The armature modifier. And yes, when you add an armature as a parent of a mesh, the mesh object, if I go under the wrench tab, actually gets a modifier called the armature modifier. And if you turn this off, well, the armature will no longer control and pose the mesh at all. So you have to have that armature modifier in your modifier stack and enabled. Now, what I've actually done here is something that's not great. I have my character mesh with a subdivision surface modifier on it. That means I've made it more complex. I've made it smoother by adding this modifier before I added the armature modifier, and that's not ideal. Normally, you'd add the armature and then subdivide your mesh to make it smoother. So your armature has to only control a simpler version of your mesh. So keep that in mind. In this case, my shoulder pads, they have the mirror modifier. The artist who made this character used the edge split modifier to make the edges of it, I suppose, have harder or sharper edges. That's fine. I'm going to select that mesh, hold Shift, select the bones in pose mode. Just one of the bones is fine. Control P, and with automatic weights, let's see what that does. If I grab a shoulder pad bone and I rotate it, you can see what it does. You'll notice that not everything is perfect. When I grab a shoulder pad bone and tap R, it's pulling mostly the right vertices in my mesh, but some of them aren't perfect. We'll talk about that briefly at the end of this video. I'll press Ctrl Z though. As for my character's helmet, I don't need it to deform with multiple bones. I don't need it to bend any elbows or shoulders or knees. So I can just take this separate mesh object and parent it directly without any deformation to a single bone. To do that, I can select that mesh, hold Shift on my keyboard, select that individual bone in pose mode. Make sure that you only have that one bone selected so I can just click on that bone. If I press Control P now, I'm not going to use Armature to form with automatic weights. Instead, I'm just going to select bone. So I'm making the mesh a child of that individual bone in that armature. So I'll click. And so now if I grab that bone, just that bone, and I tap R, it just has that helmet mesh stick to it. Okay. Same thing with the visor. I'm going to select the visor, hold Shift, select the armature, but I'm going to just select, I'll click on that bone to make it the only bone selected. Control P, bone. There we go. If I grab just that bone and rotate it, you can see how it works. I might want to constrain this bone to only rotate on the correct axis because I don't want to do something like, that with that bone. So what I can do is with that bone selected under the side panel, your properties panel, the N key on your keyboard, we can turn off rotation. That means we can enable these little locks on, I believe, the Y and Z axis. So if I use my rotate tool and I rotate my character's visor, can I rotate it in any way that I don't want to? No, it's stopping me from rotating it in bad ways. It'll only let me rotate on that red X axis because I left that one open. Okay, that's a little tip for you there. I'll press Ctrl Z or Q and all. There we go. Is my entire character finished and is it perfect? No. If I grab the controller bone, which did I forget to turn off deform on it? Yes, I did. I should have turned off deform on that controller bone before I parented my entire character mesh to the armature. That was my mistake. There we go. But if I grab that controller bone, I move my whole character around. Well, we'll talk about the sword in a moment, but his buckle was a separate mesh object. So I'll press Control Z. In fact, I'll press A and then Q and all. I need to make this deform with the mesh as well. So I'll select that mesh. Do I have any modifiers on it? I've got the subsurf modifier on it to smooth that mesh out. I might do this properly. I'll get rid of that. And so it's no longer smooth and it has no modifiers on it. I'm going to hold Shift and select a bone in my rig, doesn't matter which bone it is at all. And then I'll press Control P with automatic weights. And so now hopefully it will bend at the correct spot, and does it. If I move, let's say, my foot up using my foot IK bone, it's looking not too bad. Okay. I could go ahead now and select that mesh, and under the wrench tab, I could add that subdivision surface modifier back to smooth out that mesh again. That would be the more correct process here. I could select my mesh of my character's sword, and without even having a bone in the sword, it's a separate object after all, I could just make this mesh a child of my IK hand bone. So I'll do that. I'll select this mesh, hold Shift, select that bone with Shift selected, just that bone. Yeah, there's no other bone selected there. Control P, and I'll make it a child to that parent bone. So Control P just to the bone itself. So now if I pose, I'll just use my select tool here. If I pose or grab that hand IK bone, the sword moves along with it. Okay. Now, in terms of how your character mesh overall is controlled and deformed by your overall character rig, not all might be merry in the world. It might not work exactly as you would like. In my case, if I pose my character in such a way that the shoulder pad is rotating, if I zoom in on that part of my character mesh, you can see that these little straps that are controlling or holding on my character's shoulder pads aren't exactly deforming in the way that I would like. Over on the other side, maybe there's a more drastic problem there. You can see that if I rotate that shoulder pad, that, it's stretching in a weird way. It's going into the strap, into the body of the character, and it's not holding on at the base there. These are all very minor things, but you might have larger problems where when you made the overall mesh a child with automatic weights of the character armature, it might not have assigned all the right vertices to the right bones in your armature. In fact, if you select the character mesh and press tab to go into edit mode, and you select a single vertex in the character mesh, you can go over to that side end properties panel, or you can press that little arrow right there and go to item. And then you can see a little section here called vertex weights. You can see that this vertex here is controlled by the shoulder.r bone, the arm upper bone, and a little bit by the arm lower bone as well. And you can actually see the weights, how much of a percentage in decimal form that vertex is controlled by each of those bones. You can see that this vertex is actually controlled 0.0, that is 0% by the shoulder bone, that's fine. 80% by the upper arm bone, and 0%, maybe there is a decimal that I can't see. Yeah, they're not exactly 0. So you can see that each vertex has a weight. Under the object data tab for the mesh, so this little triangle mesh here, you can actually see under vertex groups all of the groups of vertices that were created when you went Control P with automatic weights. And these vertex groups are named the same as your bones in your armature. All the bones that have that deform checkbox checked, unlike hopefully all of your IK bones, they should not be listed here because you turned off deform for all of those, hopefully. But you can see that if I select, let's say the pelvis vertex group, and I deselect everything, all my vertices over here. So I'll press Alt-A on my keyboard. If I'm in vertex mode of my mesh and I select one of the vertex groups and I press the select button, it will select all of the vertices that have any influence at all by that bone, in this case, the pelvis bone. I'll press Alt-A on my keyboard to deselect all. What is this bone called bone? Well, did I not name the controller bone down here? I might have forgotten to do that. So what happens if I select that group and press select? Aha, it does not seem to select any vertices that I can see, and that's a good thing for me. In fact, I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode. I'm going to select that bone. That bone is just called bone. I should probably call it controller. There we go. You will make mistakes along this process. Rigging is not something that you will do perfectly on the very first try, or even after many tries, you will still make little fumbles along the way, and that's fine. It is a learning process. But if your character mesh is vastly wrong in the way it's controlled by individual bones, let's say that your arm bone is accidentally pulling the wrong parts of your mesh. If I select my mesh, there is a special mode called weight paint mode. And this mode right here under the mode menu of a mesh object is exactly for correcting problems like this, where you have vertices that are controlled by the wrong bones. So with a mesh selected, if you go to weight paint mode, you can see that it'll show you when you have a bone selected in pose mode, what vertices are controlled by that bone based on their color. This mode, like its name implies, also lets you paint the weight to your heart's desire, and this is a bit of an arduous manual process, one that I have not done enough practicing with myself. Just a note that if you are in an objects or mesh objects object mode, to go into weight paint mode, you should first select your armature and make sure your armature is in pose mode. So when you're in pose mode and you've turned off lock object modes under the edit menu and you're not in X-ray mode, so you can actually select a mesh, then if you go into weight paint mode, you can then select different bones in your armature and see the weights when you're in weight paint of the mesh. How do you select different bones in your armature when you're in weight paint of your mesh? Well, you hold Control on your keyboard and you can then click on a bone. Okay, this bone has no weighting on anything except for, I believe, what's in the shoulder pad, which is a different mesh, but you can see the weighting on different bones. I'm holding Controlling and clicking. If, let's say, I had my lower arm bone selected, and I use this paintbrush tool, which is the circle right now under my mouse, and I painted weight onto some part of my mesh that wasn't appropriate, like the side of my character. Now, right now, I actually have the brush that I'm using. This little icon here is actually a menu for different brushes. Normally, you'd be painting with the mix brush, I believe, which lets you paint adding or subtracting weight to or from a bone onto different vertices in your mesh. So you should use the mix brush, and this will let you add weight to your selected bone. And so right now, if I were to go back into object mode after just clicking and dragging on that part of my mesh, now this part of my mesh, these vertices are controlled by that bone, and that's a bad thing. So if I go back into object mode and then I select my bones and go into pose mode, if I were to pose my character, you would see that, you know, the wrong part of the mesh is being pulled by the arm bone, and that's not a good thing. So what I could do to fix this is select my mesh, make sure I'm in pose mode of my armature, but then select my mesh and go into weight paint mode, and then hold Control, click on different bones, and figure out that, oh, this bone has vertices that it should not be controlling with a weight. Blue, by the way, means that there is no weight on those vertices to the selected bone, so there's no control, and these areas are fine in blue. Obviously, red means totally controlled by the selected bone. So now if I paint with this mix brush a weight of 0, that means I'm assigning 0 weight to these vertices where I paint. And I suggest that when you're using weight paint mode, that you go to solid viewport display, and that'll make the shading, I think, more even in the way that you can see all the colors on your screen. So let's go ahead and finish this off. I'll paint all of these back to a weight of 0. As for the shoulder pads of my character, if I go back into object mode and select the shoulder pad objects, I'll turn off X-ray mode and go back into my material preview shading mode here. If I clear out, I'll go back into pose mode of my character armature, and I'll press A and then Q and clear out all the posing of my character's bones here. If I select the mesh of the shoulder pad, you can see the mesh of the shoulder pads include the straps. And if I were to pose the shoulder pads, you can see that it's not stretching the straps in a nice way. So let's go ahead and see if we can fix that using weight painting. So I'm going to select the mesh that's that part of my character, the shoulder pads, both of them. Now remember that I have that mirror modifier on this mesh before I have my armature modifier. That's going to come into play here, and it's actually quite a nice surprise that this works so well in Blender. If I go with that mesh selected into weight paint mode, and I hold Control and I click on that shoulder pad bone, you can see that, well, that bone is controlling this whole mesh, but not entirely. So I'm going to paint a weight of 1, and that means that that whole section will be controlled entirely by that bone. You might want to go to the brush menu and turn on or off front faces only. And so if you have that unchecked, you should be able to paint, through a mesh, although I'm not sure exactly how that works properly. What I will want to do, though, is make sure that these straps and the little buckles that hold the straps to the character's body are not entirely controlled by that bone, because we don't want these little buckles or snaps to go into the character's body. So I'm going to paint with a mix brush with a weight of 0, and I'm going to paint away influence on those two little sections there. I think it was okay. But if I don't have those vertices and those little snap sections assigned to any bone, they won't follow along with my character. So I'm going to hold Control and select this shoulder bone. And I want to make sure this shoulder bone is controlling those sections. So I'm going to paint with a weight of 1 and just make sure that they are being controlled by something. Okay. I might want to subtract any influence from these sections, from that shoulder bone, and maybe that bone, that section there. And I don't need these upper sections at all. I want to have some blend, though, and that's why it is acting or viewing like a rainbow up the path a little bit, but that should act better. Now, one thing I've discovered is that when you have the mirror modifier on a mesh that you're controlling with bones that also have .L and .R, it should act nicely and mirror all the painting that you do on one side for the other. You'll notice that there's a little lighter orange spot on the top here that I've painted in that way just now. And there is a matching color lighter spot on the top there. And if I go and look and compare, you can see that the colors match on both sides. And that's because of that mirror modifier. Okay. How does it work if I pose that bone? The straps are doing nicer things. That looks pretty good. I'm liking it. Okay, it's not perfect, but for the sake of this video, I think those sections are done. So I think there we have it. If I go back to object mode and I select my armature and I go into pose mode, and maybe I'll hide my side panels here, I can pose and animate my character. If I press A with a bone selected in pose mode to select my whole armature, I can clear out the pose. Maybe I want my character to have a little animated wave. So I could select the hand IK bone. By the way, if you want to hide the hand bones that you do not need to animate anymore at this point, you could select those bones that you don't want to see anymore. So I could select the smaller inner hand bone. I'll turn on my X-ray mode. If you don't want to see those anymore, you can actually go to the Armature Object Data tab and you can move bones into different bone layers. This way, when you put a bone onto separate layers over here, and if you want to do that, you can select a bone and press M for move to different layer. If you press M on your keyboard, you can click on a different little square in a matching grid. So M, and now we have a dot on this layer, and that means a bone is there. That bone that I've just moved is now on that layer, and I can leave that layer turned off. That means it's going to be invisible. That means I don't have to see it or accidentally select it as I'm animating. So if I want to go ahead and select this smaller hand bone, M to move, I can move it down to that lower layer. It's now out of the way and out of sight and out of mind and won't distract me or maybe select the wrong bone. So M, and then click, and then the smaller bone here, M, and click right there. So now if I want to animate my character, I can simply put my character where I want them to start. Maybe their hand will go up there. I'll double tap R to rotate, and then R to rotate. I will tap I on my keyboard to insert a keyframe, a location and rotation keyframe, perhaps on frame 1. This is the basics of animation here. If I go to a later frame, let's say frame 15, and I move the hand down and then rotate the hand there, and I tap I to insert a location rotation keyframe for that bone on that frame, we have a little bit of animation. There we go. My character is saying hello right there to you. Last but not least, we're going to make our bones look a little bit nicer in our viewport. This display, the way that the bones currently look in my viewport, have this little pointy look for each bone, and that's good for setting up your bones initially, but most professional artists and animators prefer to have custom bone shapes. We're not going to get there in this video, but I will show you that under the Armature tab, if I go to the viewport display section with a bone selected in pose mode, or maybe even just in object mode, I believe. If I go to viewport display under the Armature object data tab, and I change my viewport display as from octahedral, which is this shape, to stick, well, the bones appear like sticks. And this might be less obtrusive. This might be easier to select and see how your character actually looks. So if I scrub back and forth in my timeline, I can see my character better. Another common option that you will see a lot that has many benefits is the B-bone shape. B-bones are essentially square cube bones that you can make as thick or thin as you want. If I have B-bone option display as selected, I can select all of my bones. I probably want to be in edit mode for this. If I press Control-Alt-S, Control-Alt-S will let me scale the thickness of individual bones to whatever I want. So if I have all of my bones selected like I do right now, I can make them all thinner. If I want to make some bones thicker to represent the size of that part of my character, maybe the head is a big thick object, I can press Control-Alt-S and make just the head bigger, just like that. Okay, so that's an introduction to different bone shapes. But I think that's going to be it for the end of this video. I'm going to go back into pose mode and scrub back and forth and say goodbye to you. That will be it for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. My name is Colin. If you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click on that like button below this video. It really helps out me and my channel and gets these videos more seen. If you want to see more videos like this one in either Blender or in the Godot game engine, go ahead and click on that subscribe button and the bell icon below as well. Check out my Facebook and my Instagram pages. In those two places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next for this channel, and it's where I communicate with all of you the most, except here on YouTube, of course. But that'll be it for this one. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.